They took your name, your land, your language, but not your legacy. Reclaim it at AfricanAncestry.com.
All right, want to say welcome to Professor Kimoni Yaw Ajani here. I Never Knew TV. Fire, what's going on?
Like I say, brother, and peace once again. My name is Brother Kimoni Yaw Ajani, also formerly Wilbert Saint-Hilaire, and it's an honor to be in the space, brother.
Can you explain the historical weaponization of sound in Haiti? I know they pronounce it differently. Specifically, how drums were used as a strategic tool during battles and revolution.
Brother, absolutely. Especially since we're speaking on Haiti. For those who don't know, Haiti is the original name of the island, the land of high mountains in the Taino language. Drums are instrumental, especially in many of our spiritual systems. It's our modes of communications, specifically with our deities who we call the Loas. Same thing if in our older African cosmological systems, whether we talk about the Netaru and Kemet, whether we talk about the Orisha and Fire Ifa, it's instrumental. That is the heartbeat. It's the essence. In fact, Brother Desalene Adolfo, in his documentary, Voodoo: A Theology of Liberation, he actually talks about the power of sound. In fact, sound can impact our DNA. We're starting to see that with how they weaponize hip-hop against our own people.
Could you delve a little deeper in regards to how people use that in battles and during the revolutions?
Absolutely. It's a major form of communication. Particularly we use it as a signal. Let me give you an example, especially in terms of trading. Not necessarily warfare, but at least trading first, and then we'll talk about the context of warfare. For instance, if you look at the kingdom of Ouagadougou, or the empire of Ouagadougou, which is the ancient empire of Ghana, or if we look at Mali, they had a silent barter system. So if they're trading with non-African groups who may not speak the language, one of the major forms of communication is the drum. Usually you would signal the drum if one party enters, and then you would drum when the party leaves, maybe a pound of salt to trade with gold, and then I would signal and drum, to signal when the next party arrives to place the weight. And once again, it was a reasonable exchange. Now, in terms of warfare, this would strike fear in many Europeans. Just hearing the sound of drums, especially in the middle of the night when you can't see, you're not familiar with the environment. It's a psychological tactic. Especially if you've seen African people chanting, communicating with the Loas, the drumming. There's a sort of energy that can't be described.
Please speak about the U.S. occupation of Haiti from 1915 to the 1930s. And what were the motivations and what lasting effects did it have on the country?
Excellent question. And prior to that, we had 7 presidents who were disposed. Many of them would utilize the Cacos. For those who are not familiar with the Cacos, it was a major rebel group during the Haitian Revolution, especially during the major phase after the Bois Cayman ceremony of August 14, 1791. So during those series of presidents, many of them would oftentimes rely on Cacos fighters, especially from the north. The northern regions is where we have a lot of black populations. The south is mostly controlled by the gens du couleur, the few people of color. Especially where my family's from in Lac Bonite, which is a large farming region. You also have a large peasant population, but also voodoo is very strong there. So once again, the Cacos were mostly located in the mountains and those, of course, agricultural regions. Sadly, the last president, very similar to Jovenel Moïse, would be Guillaume Sam. Guillaume Sam would be disposed, but sadly, he was someone who catered to the elites. So it wasn't clean cut, and he would be killed by the people and the mob because he was not doing his duties as an African leader. And that's something that we're going to discuss a little further if we touch on Ibrahim Touré. To get more into the story, though, this is where it gets interesting. We also have to deal with the context of World War I. What's interesting about Haiti is that when Desalene said all citizens would be considered black, which is very important, much like Kemet, the land of black people, he allowed the Polish and the Germans to stay. The catch was, though, everybody would be black, even though they're not necessarily African people or black people. What he did was destroy the construction of white supremacy. When you had Saint-Domingue, you had the Grand Blanc, the rich whites, Petit Blanc. You had the gens du couleur, the free people of color, because of course they have to make a proximity to whiteness. And then the black people at the bottom. This is why we consider one of the most successful revolutions. It's a revolution because he completely dismantled that system of white supremacy to create a black nation, much like in ancient Kemet. So to go back to your question, this is where it gets interesting. Many people betrayed the visions of Desalene, such as Guillaume Sam. But you had a figure by the name of Rosvovo Bobo. He was, of course, a politician, but once again, he critiqued the elites and, of course, would lead the first Cacao War when the U.S. come in 1915. They had a fear of the Germans having influence in IT. Oftentimes, we look at history as separate episodes, but we have to connect those dots. the U.S. has specific interest in Haiti also because we're under two tectonic plates. Not only that, we have gold and oil, something they're still interested in. And of course, the U.S. is still imposing on Haiti to this day. So in 1915, they would land and change not only our constitution, because Desalene had a clause when he established the Empire of Haiti that no white person, no foreigner should own land. When the U.S. comes in, they would change that clause to allow now U.S. corporations, such as New York City Bank, to come in. Other damages include, of course, the creation of Haitian military by the Grand Marais. So not only would they dismantle our own military, but they would create their own puppet military regime. Many of them that will be led by mulatto or white generals. And this is going to also lead to some further issues later down the line when you deal with François Duvalier and Aristide. So there's, once again, when you look at the root causes of these issues, we have to specifically deal with not just the assassination of Desalene, but specifically 1915 all the way to 1936. And guess what? When they come in 1915, right next door, they come in DR in 1916. They'll occupy DR for a shorter time, till I believe I want to say 34. But nonetheless, they occupied IT for quite a long period of time, and the damage was done after that. Oh, and real quickly, I do have to mention that we also fought one of the most important leaders amongst the Caucos was Charlemagne Pelat. And we see a similar phenomenon. And I know there's some discrepancies, so I'm not gonna, try to, let me use my words carefully. I don't want to seem that I'm just praising this particular figure, but it's an interesting similarity when you look at Jimmy Chargé Barbecue, who's also a former police officer. When you look at Charlemagne Pelat, he was a former military officer. But nonetheless, both made claims that they're leading revolution against the corrupt regime.
Can you explain Papa Doc's complex relationship with the United States and how U.S. involvement, including the training of his Tonto Makoot, I hope I'm saying it properly,
Tonto Makoot,
Tonto Makoot, help empower a regime that used terror to silence opponents and control the Haitian population?
I love your question. This is going back to my family's era. My family actually grew up during the regime of François Duvalier.
Oh, so you heard the horror stories. Was it true? You can't even say this man's name to somebody, like a neighbor or something?
It's complicated. And let me start from the beginning, because there's some good things that Duvalier does. He's sometimes painted and demonized by the U.S. regime, but there's a reason for it. Originally, he was trained, him along with Trujillo, they trained them in the School of Americas, especially their paramilitary forces. This is why eventually he created the Tonto Makoot. Another reason, though, was also to deal with the fact that much of the Haitian military was still under the thumb of the U.S. military regime. But I digress. When we look at, once again, Duvalier would change his tone with the U.S., similar to Trujillo. Not only would he change the flag, because once again, he was voted by the people, he was very popular, but he would change the flag back to black and red. And in fact, when I talk to a lot of my older family members, especially my older cousin, they mention how, yes, the Tonto Makoots didn't play. If you oppose his regime, yeah, they might take you out, but they kept order. They kept the streets clean. In fact, at that time, they mentioned that IT didn't have plastic products, specifically plastic U.S. products. In other words, the country is very clean. But it begins to shift. And one of the mistakes of Duvalier was that he becomes president for life and passes down the line to his son. That's something that Desalene would never do. He had an electoral monarchy, much like Mali with Sundiata Keita, where, of course, you had him and his wife, who are the only nobility, and him and his wife, along with a council of elders, would choose the successor, because the idea was the leader of the nation would also be the father of the nation, a protector of the nation from not only invasion, but also the institution of enslavement. And when I talk about enslavement, I'm not just talking about physical. We're also talking about psychological and mental. So Duvalier had a similar tone, but once again, he passes down the line to his son, Baby Doc. And once again, he ran the country like a celebrity and was very much incompetent. So this is when the issues really begin to pop up.
In regards to Papa Doc, too, I read something that was very interesting. His not only his embracement of African spiritual practices, but his mastery of it.
He's a practitioner.
Yeah.
He's a Hugan. And for those who don't know what a Hugan is, this is a high priest in Haitian voodoo. For the women, the equivalent would be Mambo. Not only that, he's also a medical doctor with his, of course, degrees and his licenses. So he also practices European medicine. So he understands both sides. And this is essential because not only are you a politician, but you also understand the importance of feeding the nation, healing the nation, which is why he made voodoo instrumental. Once again, he made voodoo, the major religion for the country, not just Catholicism. And once again, he understands the memory of IT in the past.
when Haitians practice Catholicism, right? And you mentioned it earlier in regards to your household, the wording that they use for the reverence. But bonjour. But is it really a fusion, or are they practicing Catholicism? Because that's what I noticed with a lot of these countries and a lot of cultures, is that they get criticized for saying, hey, they're Christians. But when you really analyze it, they're not really practicing Christianity in a traditional sense. It's a heavy fusion. And I think sometimes they don't even know it's a heavy fusion because that's what they grew up in.
There's one book I want to reference, especially for our people. It's by Leslie Desmonds. It's called The Faces of the Gods, Voodoo and Roman Catholicism. And what we have to understand is we have to begin to critique this notion of syncretism. Syncretism assumes that there's an equal playing field between both religions. But that's not the context when you look at Haitian Voodoo and Catholicism. Let me give you an example of claques, for example, in Haiti today. Those who are Catholic tend to be part of the elite class. In other words, you have access to the education, you have access to the better resources. Most of them are able to travel to the U.S. as well and get another education. But when you look at the majority of the population, the peasant population, they practice voodoo. So once again, can we say this is syncretism? Can you say there's an equal playing field when you look at the institutions of Catholicism and voodoo? Even though many of the people, the majority of the people understand the power of voodoo and still adhere to the principles of voodoo. So I'll leave that there, because once again, I don't want to rub anybody the wrong way, but we have to be very honest and be very truthful. Because what's going to allow us to gain our freedom, once again, is going to be Haitian Voodoo.
Can you list some of the companies that are down there and the resources they're extracting from Haiti?
Well, but as I mentioned before, we are under two tectonic plates. So we have a lot of gold. We have a lot of, I believe it's rudium, which is even more valuable than gold. Bauxite, which forms your aluminum. You also have a lot of bauxite in Jamaica, as well as other raw natural resources, especially in terms of our agriculture, in terms of the food that we're able to produce to feed ourselves.
And export.
Exactly. We also have to talk about many of our revolutionary leaders who still have the memory of Africa. Right. I'll give you an example first, starting with Toussaint Louverture and his lineage. He's descended from his grandfather, Gal Guinou. And they like to say allegedly. But if you travel to the Alada in current-day Benin, which used to be its own kingdom, Kingdom of Alada, there's a statue of Toussaint Louverture because they know his lineage. They know where he comes from, and he does as well. His grandfather is Gal Guinou, who was formerly the Prince of Alada, but when his father Soso dies, he will become the king of Alada. This is around 1724. He would be in conflict with his brother Hussar, and Hussar would leave to the kingdom of Dahomey. And I mentioned Agaja and his wife Wangil. Agaja would give him some soldiers, and Hussar would come back, defeat his brother Gal Guinou, and sell him into enslavement. Eventually, he would be sold to the French and would land on the Breda plantation in Saint-Domingue. Toussaint's original name would be Toussaint Breda. So once again, he still has the memory of his ancestral history and his royal line. After all, he could speak multiple African languages. He could speak Fombe. He could speak French. So once again, this shows why he was able to be a very good diplomat. Now, when we look at Jean-Jacques Desalene.
That makes sense. I never knew that history. It's a bloodline thing with this breaker in there.
Now you're seeing the deeper connection.
I got you.
Now, when you look at Jean-Jacques Desalene, he would be raged because his mother would die. And of course, he would give Desalene to one of her close friends. Her name is Abduraya Toyamantu. She was a Gojamino, a general in the Dahomey army. And many of you might be familiar with the Dahomey women warriors, or the Goji Mino. So once again, she would train him not only in African combat arts or African military strategies as seen in the kingdom of Dahomey, but give him a clarity of who his people is as well as who his enemies is. This is why Desalene would not be fooled to make deals with the French. And that context is very important. After all, we all receive a foundation from our family, from our culture foundations, and that's important. That's what's going to allow us to push back against the enemies that are still on our necks today.
You know, it's wild. I never knew about that bloodline history, and it makes sense because I was always amazed at how did this person rise up at such an age, but it was already there. It's been there. It's in his blood. That's his history.
Yes.
Yeah. I never knew that, man. I appreciate that.
Brother, I didn't know this either until I really want to commend my advisor, Dr. Amma Mazama. At the time, she brought me back home to Haiti for the first time in 2017. And usually, those of you who are Haitian Americans, you might have some families during that era, are afraid of you getting kidnapped or going back home due to, maybe family or political situations. But when she took me back home, we were able to go to Bois Cayman. We were able to go to my family's hometown of Lato Bonite, Cap Haïtien, Jacques Mel, which is also the house where Dr. Mazama got initiated. But the next year in 2018, she would take me to Benin. She would bring me to Ouida, the source of voodoo. She would bring me to Alada, Porto Novo. And that's when I was able to look at the primary sources. That's when I was able to see the statue of Toussaint Louverture, which is another primary source, as well as hear the oral traditions and the oral stories, both in Haiti and Benin, which allowed me to give context for my dissertation and later my book, The African Revolution in Haiti, Liberté ou la Mort, Freedom or Death. So without dealing with the primary text and the sources, we're not going to have a long memory of why these things are occurring, why we were able to kick out the French, why we were able to, once again, utilize voodoo to restore ourselves.
What is the real situation in Haiti today, and how has the United States contributed to that situation, both directly and indirectly?
Right now, the U.S. is dictating the destiny of Haiti. Not just the U.S. There's an organization known as the Core Group. And you guys might be familiar with Dr. Bertrude Albert or Jemima Pierre. They also touch on the Core Group. For those who are not familiar with the Core Group, it includes ambassadors from the United States, Canada, France, Organization of American States, Brazil, as well as the UN. And these are the ones who dictate who are the prime ministers or the leaders of Haiti. In other words, us as the Haitian people, we're not allowed to really choose our own leaders, which is why the youth are rising up. But it gets more complicated when, of course, you have foreign firearms. And, of course, during Jovenel Moïse, you also had a drug operation. And I believe, yes, the CIA was involved when you look at those who were a part of that assassination plot. Some of them were Haitian Canadians or Haitian Americans. And of course, we have to be honest on who the enemy is. Why is it that they want to keep Haiti under their thumb, keep it in a state of anarchy and chaos as we see in the Congo and Sudan? We see the similarities. And once again, I want to commend Brother Ibrahim Touré because he understands the game plan they utilize every single time in our history to destabilize us and to create anarchy and chaos so they could say that we can't govern amongst ourselves.
Do you believe the spirit of resistance, brilliance, courage, and resilience that defined Haiti's revolutionary past still lives in the DNA of Haitians today?
Absolutely. Desalene gave us a memory and a motto. A revolutionary proclamation. Liberté ou la mort. Which is also the colors of our flag. Freedom or death. But most importantly, coupe-tête boulaka. If you're dealing with oppressor, then yes. If you're dealing with a corrupt system, then yes, there's going to be a time when you have to burn down the house and cut off their heads. And oftentimes, we have people who often assume that we're just the opposite of whites and we're not necessarily violent or we're just peaceful. No, if you understand our ancient past, even in ancient Kemet, there are times where we had to crack the heads of our enemies or our foreign enemies.
I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of times when you hear people speak about African history, it's presented as some utopia oasis where there was no conflict. There was no violence. Everyone was living good in peace. And I don't know how that's possible to sustain a society, an empire. And that's the thing. And there's a narrative out here is that, yes, white people have a history of violence, but black people, it's like we don't even deal with violence. Now, the approach to violence may be different. The utilization of that violence may be different, but you still need violence to maintain your empire. And I think that we've been beaten over the head so much with, I don't know if it's the Christianity, because I really been reevaluating morality. I really have been like really struggling within myself of the idea I have of morality, just the concept of morality itself, especially the idea I have internalized about morality and how it's been influenced by obviously Christianity, being a black person in America. And I'm still trying to figure that out.
It's interesting. I saw an interesting presentation by ASCAT that included my brother Dr. Ukanini Tawadoro and Obemfo Obedele Kabon, who teaches at the University of Ghana. And they tell an ancient story dealing with the Hyksos, also known as the Amu, which are foreign Eurasian desert dwellers or foreigners, and how they came into Kemet. First, they came as friends, seeking assistance and shelter. And then later they would conquer a territory, sack temples, and occupy more land. And what's interesting is how they dealt with those foreigners or their enemies. Because what you say is absolutely correct. When you look at the primary sources, they had a way of how they labeled those who knew they were black, those who might be allies, but also those who are our enemies. And I think that context is important because once again, you're dealing with power relationships. Oftentimes, you have to understand when you're dealing with a superpower or a nation, you're also going to have power dynamics with how you're going to treat certain groups. And oftentimes people assume that, yes, that everything's a utopia, but that's not reality. When you look at reality, things aren't always sweet. And oftentimes they understood how to deal with their enemies. There are tenets and there are documents of how they documented how they deal with their enemies. So once again, these are lessons that we can utilize even today. But if we don't understand those stories, such as the Amu or the Hyksos, then we won't have those examples.